Alright, this video is going to be a continuation of my video series on Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. For those of you who aren't familiar with Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, please see my other videos for details, but in brief, it's a genetic disorder where a person has mental retardation. They really aren't able to move without a wheelchair. They're basically stuck in a body where they're not able to move properly, and they also have the one symptom that's really characteristic of Lesch-Nyhan syndrome is self-mutilation, specifically the biting of the fingers, biting of the lips. So self-mutilation is something that's really typical of Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. Now, Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, like I've said in other videos, is caused by a mutation in the HPRT enzyme. So the gene that codes for the HPRT enzyme is located on the X chromosome, and it's mutated in people with Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. Now, they've taken rats with a similar mutation to Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, and what they found is that these rats do not self-mutilate. In 1993, a study was done where they took rats with the HPRT deficiency, and they wanted to see if possibly another enzyme called APRT was helping to make up for the lack of HPRT enzyme activity. And what they found was when they gave the HPRT deficient mice a drug that also inhibited APRT, these mice started to self-mutilate. Now, this was very, very interesting. So 3 years later, a different group published a study where they bred mice that had a genetic deficiency in both HPRT enzyme and APRT enzyme. So they took different groups of mice with the genetic deficiencies, and they bred them to end up getting a mouse with deficiencies, actually probably more than one mice with genetic deficiencies in both enzymes. So with these mice, you'd expect, based on the previous study, that these mice would self-mutilate. But it turned out that wasn't the case. So these mice turned out not to be a good model organism for Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, at least from the behavioral perspective. Now, there was another study done in 1994 that was kind of along the different lines. The focus of this study wasn't so much on the behavioral symptoms. They were trying to study the production of things like dopamine in the brain, and they found that dopamine levels with rats with HPRT deficiency end up being lower than what they're supposed to be. And so this told us something about HPRT deficiency. And obviously I'm going to make another video on the ethics of animal testing to follow up, but just for the practicality aspect of it, purely from the perspective of assuming that animal testing on mice is okay, we're going to say, is this scientifically valid given the fact that mice and humans are different? And I would say yes, it's still scientifically valid. We have to keep in mind that mice and human beings are two different species. However, they do have a lot of similarities. There's a lot of DNA similarities, there's a lot of physiological similarities, a lot of anatomical similarities, and thank God, otherwise we wouldn't be able to do these types of tests on mice. But because they are very similar to human beings in their biology, we are able to do biological testing on mice, and we're able to get pretty good results. We end up learning a lot by studying model organisms, things like fruit flies, yeast, mice, zebrafish, things like this, and of course E. coli. Scientists are able to learn a lot about how genetics and biochemistry work, and then by studying in these model organisms, and then they're able to look at the genetics, look at the physiology of other organisms, and based on what they find in the model organisms, it helps them to figure out what's going on in a human being, or what's going on in some other animal that you can't just readily test very, very quickly. So obviously, testing things like drugs in mice before giving them to human beings, that's obviously one example of how studying a model organism helps you to understand the effects in human beings. Now, a model organism is never a perfect is never a perfect model of a human being, because it's not a human being, but it's still valid to help us understand the science of what's going on. Alright, now I'm going to make a follow-up video, like I said, on the ethics of animal testing, so please feel free to check that out as well. I'll try to leave a link right about here. So feel free to check that out. This is Greg, out.